There are some stories in the outback that were never meant to be told. Not because they didn't matter, but because they were buried. Mulga Hill, Silverton, 1891. 2 small bodies, found in the earth just metres from a home. When police arrived, part of one child was already visible, a small hand, a head. Breaking through the dust, they dug, and what they uncovered wasn't just death, it was silence. 2 infant girls, fully formed, buried just 4 yards from the front door. Inside that house lived Harriet Hobber, 23 years old, unmarried, living in a 4-room house with her father, her sisters, and a mother described as too unwell to notice what was happening around her. A house full of people, and somehow no one knew. On the night of August 14th, Harriet gave birth. Alone on the floor of a bedroom she shared with her family. No doctor, no midwife, no one called. 2 children, twin girls. They never cried, never moved. She would later say she listened, but heard nothing. So she covered them in her skirts. She said that she doesn't remember even giving birth, or, as was the language then, her confinement. By morning, before the house had fully woken, at 5:30 a.m., Harriet took a shovel. The ground was soft, the hole already there, and she buried them, alone. What followed wasn't compassion. It was scrutiny, judgment, cold observation. A neighbour noticed the head protruding from the ground near the house. He notified the police, who once had exhumed the tiny bodies, called for a box to carry the bodies back to be examined. A young woman, completely alone in the world with respect to her condition, deserted by the twins' father. She hid it from her whole family. She gave birth on the floor in a room that her sisters and mother also slept in. She was silent throughout her confinement, no doctor, no help at all, and watched the babies as they all lay on the floor. Harriet was just a shadow of herself, weak physically and emotionally. By October 1891, Harriet stood before the court, described as being in a pitiful condition. Her appearance, her mind, her worth, discussed openly. Measured, dismissed. One witness even suggested that if she had been prettier, she might have had a better life. To the charge of concealing the death of her twin daughters, which was reduced from infanticide. The medical examiner had examined tissue from the lungs of the tiny girls and declared that they had never drawn breath and so were not alive when born. "How do you plead?" she answered, barely audibly, head bowed. "Guilty. 9 months imprisonment, Silverton jail." And this is where the story changes, because this isn't just history. This is a place we can still stand in. A single narrow cell, stone walls, a small window, set high above eye level, just enough for light, not for seeing out. A thick steel door, a heavy bolt, and a small opening. Just wide enough for someone to look in, but not to reach through. This is where Harriet spent her days, and her nights. Alone. Toilets were crude wooden boxes in an open yard, bathing, a tin tub in a place that offered no privacy. This wasn't punishment alone, it was exposure, it was endurance, and outside those walls, something unexpected was happening. There was uproar. Broken Hill, Silverton, newspapers filled with her story. And on more than one occasion, Multiple stories in the same edition. People began to ask, was this justice? On December 16th, 1891, a petition was sent to the Department of Justice. Thousands of signatures, 700, from miners, men who worked underground, who understood hardship, who saw something in her story. Her father, Robert Hobber, with the help of Justice Mr. Cann, fought for her release. And then there's something else. A letter written to the paper in October 1891. Not by a stranger, by her father, Robert Hobber. He doesn't rage, he doesn't demand. He asks a question. Did they temper justice with mercy? I think not. He speaks about the trial, about the suggestion that the children might have lived if only proper care had been given. And then he says something that cuts through everything. At the time of childbirth, few women are responsible for their actions. This is a man in 1891 trying to explain something we still struggle to talk about properly now. Shock, trauma, isolation. He asks people to imagine her position, alone, terrified, trying to hide her condition, not just from the world, but from her own family. And he doesn't just defend her. He points somewhere else. The vile seducer who goes free by law. No charge, no punishment, no scrutiny. Just her standing in a courtroom, carrying everything. George Dawson, the father, is unaffected. And then he turns to the people reading. What happens to the next girl? The next one, in the same position. The same fear, the same silence. He asks, not just for his daughter, but for all of them. And buried inside that letter is something else again. 700 miners signing for her release. Men who worked underground, who understood pressure, darkness, survival. Men who recognised that what happened in that room wasn't simple. And maybe that's why this story didn't disappear completely. Because even then, someone was trying to make people see her as human. Because for all the talk, for all the judgment, very few had stood beside her. On Sunday, February 14th, 1892, Harriet Hobber was released, returned safely to Broken Hill. And then she disappeared. Not physically, not immediately, but from the story, from the town, from the narrative people were willing to tell. She went on to marry. She had 5 children. She lived a life that history barely recorded. Until 1931, when she passed and was buried at Cheltenham Cemetery in Adelaide, where her husband, John E. Matthews, was laid beside her in 1934. It was said that relatives still mourned her. Dear Harriet. But here's the thing about places like Silverton. Stories don't just disappear. They settle, they stay, they wait. Because when you stand inside that jail, in that cell, you don't just see history, you feel it. And maybe what we've been taught to call magic is just reality, still holding on to the stories that were never allowed to be told. And this is the part where history meets something else. I've stood inside that cell, the one Harriet occupied, for 5 months. It's small, uncomfortably small. There's almost nothing there. A bed and a cup. That's it. When you're in that space, you can't escape it. There's no distraction, no distance. Just you and whatever that room still holds. I asked for her out loud, invited her to come forward to speak if she was able. But I also knew the amount of energy that's passed through that cell, the number of people who've suffered in that space. It wouldn't be simple. We did capture responses, electronic voice phenomena, but the voices were male. And that matters because it reminds us this isn't a controlled environment. It's not a stage. It's history interacting with the present in ways we don't fully understand. But I'll go back because sometimes it's not about forcing a response. It's about returning respectfully, consistently, and maybe over time she'll trust us enough to let her story be heard. This is the Outback Unseen.